Welcome to Seminary Reacts. I am the host, Amy Marshall, and we are here for a special session of Seminary Reacts because we are at Goshen College, and some of our questions that we are going to be responding to today are actually coming from Goshen students. So this is a very special opportunity for us to be doing a live recording here. Our guest today is Jamie Pitts. He is a professor of Anabaptist Studies at AMBS and also author of the book Organizing Spirit here. And you've been on the podcast before, but for our in-person guests, can you say a little bit about what you teach, what you're passionate about before we get started? Because, I mean, we're going to be asking a lot of tough questions, so you have to list your qualifications for that.
Okay. I teach in the areas of theology, history, and ethics. And so at AMBS, it's, the A and the M, Anabaptist Mennonite. So I teach a lot of classes about the history of that tradition and different theological perspectives around that tradition. And that's kind of the heart of my passion. How do we think about these sorts of hard questions that we're going to be talking about tonight from the perspective with the resources of Anabaptist tradition, Mennonite history, not just the history that comes from Europe, but also the global reality of the tradition today.
Great. Well, are you ready for us to dive into our first question?
Let's do it.
All right. So our first question, which is coming from a Goshen student, is, it's super easy. How can you know that God is real?
Right. I didn't say I had the qualifications for that kind of a question. Yeah, I think when you have a question like that, it's a really important question. I'd be curious to know what the person who asked that's expectations are. What are they hoping to get from an answer to that question? What kind of knowledge are they looking for? So when we say we know something is real, it makes a big difference whether that is an object, like, do I know the phone in my pocket is real? I can't see it right now. I can feel a bit of a tug of the weight of the phone, and I could pull it out and show it to everybody, and I'm pretty sure everybody would say, yeah, that's a phone, it was in your pocket. And we would have a high level of confidence that that phone is real. And if there was any doubt, we could, take a hammer to it, we could weigh it, we could do all sorts of things to make sure it is real. It's quite different if you're talking about an idea, let's say. Do I know that democracy is real? Do I know that justice is real? How do we go about assessing the reality of something like that? We can look at different institutions, we can look at practices like voting, but of course there's debates. Is the United States really a democracy today? Was it really democracy a few years ago when it was just, one party after another of rich white people mostly, getting elected to various offices in this country? Is that really a democracy? But we have the idea of democracy and we say it's real. How do we do that? God is neither an object that we could touch, nor is God an idea that we simply think about. And it might be more useful to think about how we say we know somebody. When I say that I have a friend and, I know her very well, how do I know that? What's the basis for my claim that I know someone? It's an interpersonal knowledge. Yes, that person can be, seen and touched and weighed and so forth, like the phone. That person, in some ways, we have the name, we have the idea of the person that we can talk about and debate the reality of that, of a person. But ultimately, when we're talking about interpersonal knowledge, that is irreducibly about my experience. And when we're talking about God, God is not an object or an idea. God is a person, and God as a person is different than all other people, right? Because we say that God is, and this is, Christians would say this, Jews, Muslims, many people from different religions would say that when we use the language of God, we're not talking about just one being among others. We're talking about the source of all being. So how do you know the source of all being? And for Christians, at least, and Jews and Muslims, among others, would say that God is personal in some way. And so there's this way in which we say that we know God reliably because we have gotten to know God, because we have personal knowledge of God, because we have met God in prayer, because we have praised God and sensed God's presence. We're part of communities in which we testify to one another about our experience of God. And if we trust each other, and that's always in question, or can be in question, then we take each other's word as reliable. And so, do we know that God is real? How do we know that God is real? It's a different kind of answer than if you're talking about an object like a phone. It's even a different kind of answer than you're just talking about some abstract idea. It's more like a person that you have to get to know. And it's through the practice of relating to God that you can say, yeah, I know God. I have confidence that God is real.
Yeah, there's a lot of good reflection there. I know a question that I'll pose back to you about this is like, I think there's kind of a joy and a beauty in people being able to say, oh, this is my experience with God, and just to be able to see the range of different experiences people have with God. But there is also a reality that people have an experience with God and say that God is real and have very vastly different understandings of what that means, sometimes in harmful ways, because they say, well, I know God is real because this is my experience, and they use it as an excuse to do harm in some way, versus like others who say like, well, this is a life-changing thing that made me so much better, and here's like the net positive that it's made me have on the world. I mean, how do you as someone who believes in God kind of like accept that everyone who, when they say that they have experiences with God, sometimes they are so drastically different, and it feels like you can't like reconcile all those things together?
Yeah, there's definitely, because God is someone that we get to know, and there's an irreducibly personal dimension. We make claims about God. We say that we know God and know these things about God, and that maybe God is telling us to do certain things that are very different. And that's both a beauty of knowing God, but also it's a real danger. It's beautiful because the personal character of God means that I can know God, and I can have a relationship with God. And there may be a lot that's shared with you and how you know God, but it's God's presence to my life isn't just the same as yours. And that's beautiful in a certain way, I think. But when our different understandings of God arising from these different experiences come into conflict, what do we do? And obviously we can see what people do around the world because we kill each other sometimes. We do lots of horrible things. And I laugh in some way, but it's no laughing matter because it's very real today as we're sitting here. That people are claiming a knowledge of God that leads them to kill other people. There's a lot of things we can do, though, with our differences, our different understandings about God, between saying it's a matter of total indifference, and it doesn't really matter. You know God, I know God, or you don't know God, who cares? It's all your perspective. That's one position that would say it's totally indifferent. The opposite end of the spectrum would be to say, I am so convinced that I'm going to kill you if you do not agree with me. What's in between? Some good, some bad, but hopefully on the better end of the scale, it's saying, let's talk about that. What's the basis? Because no experience is simply purely individual. We are shaped within families, within communities, religious communities, other communities, and the way we're shaped, to some important extent, shapes how we experience the world. And so likely, if we're part of a similar community, we're going to have somewhat similar, at least, experiences of God. And so we can get to know that community. How does the community that formed me, that shaped me, help me see God in ways that make me receptive to people who are different? That's one question. How does the way that the community that shaped me to understand God in certain ways close me off from other people, close me off from other communities, lead me to react defensively, angrily, violently? So if we can get to know our personal experience and see it as shaped within different kinds of communities, then we're talking about collective experience, and we can evaluate that. It's not just about me, it's about us, and we can talk about, we didn't actually, Amy and I did not grow up in the same community, but let's say we had, what was valuable? What do you see as valuable about the way you were shaped to, you learned, again, if knowing God is about getting to know God, how did you learn to pray, Amy? What kind of worship experience did you have? Was reading the Bible really important to you? And did you sense God's presence there? Were there ways in which those kinds of practices maybe weren't very helpful for you, that maybe felt really restrictive? Other ways that you felt so alive and that you felt God's presence? And then we can talk. That's what theology is, basically. It's talking it's bringing me as a person to the table, but in light of us. And knowing that whoever we are, there's going to be more than one us. There's going to be multiple communities. And so we can get to know one another, but also one another's communities, how our communities have tended to think about, encourage people to try to get to know God in certain ways. And as we look at those kind of communal ways of thinking about God or getting to know God, we can compare, and hopefully together we get a little bit better about knowing God truly. I think that's a lot better than simply saying it doesn't matter. It does matter. You're probably sitting here because it matters to you, right? To some degree, I'm guessing. Or you're listening to this and because it matters to you. So it's not simply an individual, personal perspective that is of no interest to anybody else. But it's also not the kind of thing that I would suggest that you kill someone for. So what's in between? It's talking about it. It's carefully getting to know one another and having sometimes really hard conversations, but I would hope you would say at the seminary, often really joyful conversations too as we get to know each other.
So while we see this question of how can you know that God is real, there is an individual aspect to it, but there's also a communal, collective conversation. That's a big part of that too.
Definitely.
Yeah, even amidst disagreement.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right, we're going to go on to our second question, which also comes from a student. And the question is there such a thing as unforgivable sin? So there's kind of several questions within one question there.
Okay.
But I guess the first question is, what is sin?
What is sin?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say on the unforgivable part of it first.
Okay.
I grew up in a church where sometimes I or friends would get very anxious about did I do this sin against the Holy Spirit? And I'm never going to be forgiven. So I know for a fair amount of Christians, this becomes a really emotionally heavy question. And the other place that this question appears sometimes is around when someone takes their own life. And so I just want to acknowledge the weight of that question. It can be a sort of, we can be very intellectual about this question and go into definitions of sin and so forth. But it's a question that sometimes comes from deep pain, from anxiety, and also deep pain with people that we love who may have ended their own lives. So I want to acknowledge that, and that's real. On the question of sin, yeah, huge question. So many ways that we talk about sin and God in our culture imagines that God is primarily a lawgiver, and law is this like rigid structure of things you're supposed to do or not do. One of the interesting things for me as I began to study the Bible and theology is I learned that the word law in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's about a way of life. It's a path. Yes, there are regulations at times given as part of the legal material in the Bible, but it's always part of a story of a people who God is trying to call and form, to bless. And the priority in the giving of legal requirements is not so that God can kind of judge, okay, you did that one, no, you didn't do that one, you're out, okay, and you did these things. But rather, it's about walking with God. So this imagery of walking, a path, a journey, that's the priority. And the language of sin in the Bible similarly has this idea of kind of a path or walk. So it's the language is of a target that you can kind of aim at and maybe get more or less right. The legal material in the Bible changes as well. It's, the Bible is written over thousands of years and involves intensive editorial work. And you see in different contexts, different authors and editors actually changing parts of the law. So it's not about a static list of things that you must or must not do. It's rather about a life of walking with God as God's people, so as a community. And there's different ways of thinking about kind of, okay, what is all that? So what are we actually talking about? Life with God, walking with God. Doesn't the language of sin, even generously thought of as like aiming at a target or a goal? Still, you can get things wrong, right? Mm-hmm. So that's part of what this question is asking. Some of the ways we might think about what it means to go wrong on that path or get off the path, perhaps. Could be, for instance, when someone has a deep understanding or is confronted by a deep example of faithful, loving life and rejects that. It's really hard to imagine. As I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about the Central American bishop, Oscar Romero, who was quite a conservative bishop coming up, and then he became like a high archbishop in his country. And when he got to that level, he started living and preaching and acting radically in solidarity with the poor. Mm. And the regime saw him do that and killed him. Like, that is a radical rejection of the loving witness of to the good news of God. That's a way to go wrong. I think it's important to be able to say that. It's important to be able to say that there are ways to receive a witness, to see a witness, and reject it. And that happens. So to have language, sin is language that we can use to talk about that. There's also, I've talked about community at different points here, and when we're looking to live on the path, on the journey with God, we do that not simply as individuals. Yes, there's a personal dimension, but with others. And we can hurt other people. We can wound other people. We can attack other people. And again, we need a language that helps us talk about how harming one another is has a spiritual reality. There's a spiritual reality because God is our loving creator. And so when I harm another one of God's creatures, I am in some way in opposition to God. There's also, again, that irreducibly personal part of that journey. Am I growing? Am I growing in wisdom, growing in maturity, growing to be the kind of person who can be a sort of witness like Romero? Mm. Am I growing to be the kind of person who can take responsibility when I harm community, do the work of repair, of seeking justice? Or am I, that's uncomfortable. I don't want to do that. For Christians, the kind of standard for all of these in terms of kind of embracing witness and embodying witness, growing in maturity, being healthy and contributing member of community is Jesus. And so sin is not a kind of abstract concept, but rather it's, in some ways, we can think about it as like when we don't hit the goal of living like Jesus. But again, we can think about the kind of the personal dimension, the communal dimension, and more directly in terms of when we reject genuine witness to God and the way of God. So those might be some ways we might think about sin, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think kind of before we go on to this idea of what's considered unforgivable, I want to keep thinking about this idea of sin because I know if you're not aware, for those of you who are in the room, a lot of the time when we are putting together these episodes, we are using stories and questions that are coming from Reddit. And so many of the questions that I end up seeing on Reddit are specifically about sin. It's everything from, I watched this movie, was that a sin? I said this thing to my sister, is that a sin? I mean, like, so much of it is just obsessed with what sin is. And it's so focused on individual actions. And so it seems like that perception of what sin is and really trying to nail down what every single thing we do, whether it's considered to be a sin or not, that's kind of like a pretty mainstream perception of sin. But yeah. I mean, that's a very different way of perceiving sin than what you're kind of saying here.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about a shift that might be helpful is instead of primarily thinking about the negative, like what did I not do, what did I do that was wrong, to think about the positive in terms of the goal of walking with God in community towards being like Jesus. How do we encourage one another in that journey? You know, I'm struck by in so many churches, you know, they might have like accountability partners or we would discern. The primary focus is on the negative, like what are you not doing that you should be doing, or what did you do that was wrong? And I sometimes wish we could shift more towards like an encouraging understanding and way of relating to one another. Again, it's important to have language to be able to say, wow, you're really being a jerk. And not just like mean or something, but you're really harming the fabric of this community. Mm-hmm. And to talk about the spiritual reality of that. Of course, that can be twisted, that can be abusive, but it's also real, and we need to be able to talk about it. And kind of in day-to-day life, I think some of the more encouraging way of thinking might be more helpful than constantly focusing on this sense that we have like failed to obey a kind of law.
Yeah. So now going back to the original question, is there such a thing as unforgivable sin? And what exactly does that mean if sin is unforgivable?
Right. So again, it depends what we have in mind that we think could be unforgivable. So if there's some kind of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, sin against the Holy Spirit, which I have to say I'm partial to the version in Luke because it occurs right before a story about an unjust manager, and Luke is very concerned with economic justice, and Jesus, from very early on in the book of Luke, he identifies his ministry as the one who is sent by the Spirit to bring good news to the poor. So it seems like blasphemy against the Holy Spirit in Luke is some kind of economic injustice. And I think that's worth sitting with, thinking about hard. That's definitely not when I was a kid, worrying that I had somehow, because I had cursed or I had, I don't know, like said something mean to my mom, had blasphemed against the Holy Spirit. It maybe gets us a little bit closer to the heart of what Jesus cared about. But still, the question circles around this idea of unforgivability, that there's something we could do that God would not forgive. And, this gets us into deeper territory around like afterlife and heaven and hell and all these kinds of things that we probably don't have time to get all the way into. I just would ask anybody thinking hard about this question to think about the love and mercy of God. How far, how deep does that run? And the New Testament, Paul and other authors claim over and over that all things are reconciled by Christ. And so what would it mean to say there's some sin that is beyond the reach of God's love? That's where I would want to end my answer to that, yeah.
So your official answer to that would be no, then?
Certainly would want to hope that, because we can think about often if we're going to throw examples of what about Hitler? What about some terrible person? Didn't the horrible things they do, isn't that unforgivable? In a certain way, obviously. It's just the fact that we're using that as an example means that the truly evil character of his actions continue to be, something that we hold against that person. But what does it mean? I would ask, what does it mean to say that even that evil can't be reached by God's love? I would want to I do put my faith and my hope in God's love.
Yeah. All right. We are going to move on to our last question, which is also coming from a Goshen College student, which is, how important are cultural practices in your faith?
Okay. Thanks. By the way, I should say thank you to the Goshen College students for asking that and other questions. These are great questions. What is a cultural practice? One direction my mind goes with this question has to do with the ways that worship is always cultural. And so when I go to church on Sunday, I'm certainly participating in a set of cultural practices that, it's a Mennonite church, and a lot of the people in the congregation are singing parts from the hymn, and that is a very different cultural practice than I grew up with, where there was a hymn. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and there was a hymn, but it was only the choir that was singing the parts, really. All the rest of us were kind of droning the melody a bit. And so this cultural practice I engage as part of a Mennonite church is quite different and distinct. And it's not like that was just born with Christianity or something, or even born with the Mennonites. It's actually a very relatively recent cultural practice that Mennonites adopted in like 150 years ago, or within that time frame. This gets us to the other part of the question, I think, which is how might we think about culture and theological conviction? If the object of our faith is God, and God is beyond all culture, as I talked about earlier, God is the source of all of creation, and so God can't be confused with culture. And the Bible and much of Christian theology is very intense about this, temptation to idolatry. And one way to think about what idolatry is when we confuse our culture or our own images of God with God. God being beyond any culture or idea or language is really important. This is why the ancient Israelites, for instance, were commanded not to make images of God, because It was a way of acknowledging that God was beyond any cultural representation. Yet, we talk about God. And we read this Bible, which was written in culturally specific languages, and, again, of the thousands of years period during which the Bible was written, the Israelites are interacting with all sorts of different cultures, and they're being formed, the narratives, they're being formed into a people. And part of that is these cultural practices. So culture is inescapable in theology. So it's like holding together both the fact that all of our faith practice is cultural. And in fact, it brings together many cultures. And then on the other hand, this kind of like call to not confuse our cultures with God. And it's kind of it's a tension, or I might say it's a dance. And I like the imagery of dance because dance is cultural, and dance hopefully is fun. And when we can get in touch with our cultural backgrounds, and there can be things that we lament, things that we want to put to the side, but also things that we really enjoy. And claiming those as part of, how we know God, how we think about God, how we talk about God, how we relate to God, can be a joyful dance. But part of that dance is also the withdrawal to say, but it's still not God. And how is, again, back to that imagery and practice of talking, the work of theology, talking about our different experiences, our different cultural understandings of God, is also being open to hearing, like, you might be confusing some part of your culture with God. And so the kind of movement towards and the movement away is part of that dance of culture and theology. So again, to answer the question very specifically, all of my faith is cultural. And hopefully it's not only cultural.
Yeah. And I mean, kind of stealing the question away from you a little bit, I think a huge part of my faith formation when I was in college was understanding that. And I went to college with a very particular set of expectations as to, like, this is what it means to worship God. And it was very limited. And by going to college and by talking to people about the way that their faith played out in their lives, especially spending a lot of time with international students and learning about the different ways around the world that God is worshipped, I kind of realized, like, whoa, like, Christianity is really big. And, like, growing up, we talked about how big God is, but, like, I was like, whoa, God is big. Because it was just amazing to see all the different ways that people were worshiping God. And yeah, there's all these arguments about what's considered, like, the quote unquote right way, in terms of, like, the ways that the Bible is used and the way that music is used, and, like, this line between what's considered to be cultural and what's considered to be like actually Christian, I guess. But there was also just this sense of, like, being with people who worship God in such different ways in the same room. We would do these different worship practices together, and I would get this sense of like, wow, we are all so serious about this. We are all truly worshiping God together. And yeah, I mean, it just gave this amazing reality that, like, yes, our cultural practices are important to our faith in the way that we're practicing it. But there is such a beauty in the different ways that culture has impacted the ways that we worship God and the ways that we understand God. And we can constantly take that as an opportunity to learn from each other, to learn more about God and deepen our own faith.
Yeah, so when I was a college student, I was part of this church and campus ministry that was, all the music was contemporary worship with the band. And it was very much focused on this experience of the Holy Spirit. And we talked about other Christians as dead Christians. Because they did not use this same kind of, they did not have this same if you walked in, at least as we thought, we walked into another church and they didn't have their hands up, they weren't praying in tongues, there weren't people, being prayed for healing on the floor, all this kind of stuff. So they're not really living Christians because they don't have the Holy Spirit. One of the things that I've learned in the years since then is both to appreciate the culture that was trying, I remember the pastor sometimes saying, you go to like the sporting event on the weekend and you're screaming and we want to see the same energy for God. Isn't God like better than your, like the basketball player or whatever? And that's beautiful. Like there's a cultural model of getting really excited and it has to do with like going like this, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But there was a confusion in that church, or at least I was confused, about the cultural shaping of a worship experience and a style of worship and what it really meant to experience God. Mm-hmm. Because you can have a deeply authentic encounter with God sitting in the dark in silence. You can also have a deeply authentic experience with God, encounter with God, shouting and raising your hands. And there are cultural factors that shape different worship experiences and worship, the way worship is organized. But it's really easy if we like one of those cultures, we grow up in one of those cultures, have a really meaningful experience in one of those cultures, to assume that's the only way to do it. And that's where we get in trouble.
Yeah. Well, as we close up here today, I also want to give my thanks to the Goshen students that provided questions for us. I think it led to some really awesome conversations. Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us here. Thank you, Jamie, for answering these questions for us. And thank you to the viewers or listeners that have been listening or watching the podcast. If you enjoyed, please leave a like or review the podcast. If you have any themes you would like us to focus on, if there are posts on Reddit that you would like us to react to, or if there are questions or stories that you would like us to respond to, please leave that in a comment. You can always find Seminary Reacts on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We will see you next time. Bye!